The sound of fabric tearing cuts through the busy Saturday afternoon air like a knife. Crystal Johnson's white blouse rips down the front as Officer Tom Smith's meaty hands yank at her clothing, exposing her bra to dozens of shocked onlookers in downtown Millbrook's busiest shopping district. "Please, stop. You're hurting me." Crystal's voice cracks with humiliation as she desperately tries to cover herself, but Tom's grip tightens on what remains of her torn shirt. This is the moment that changed everything. The moment when a routine day of shopping became a viral sensation that would shake a community to its core and leave a racist cop speechless in the face of unexpected resistance. But how did we get here? And what happened next that left Officer Tom Smith, a man who thought his badge made him untouchable, completely stunned by the crowd's reaction? Before we dive into this incredible story of courage and community, I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed racism like this in public? What would you do if you saw someone being humiliated and abused by someone in authority? Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your voice matters in this conversation. This is a story about the moment ordinary people decided they'd seen enough. A story about how silence can be broken, how power can be challenged, and how one woman's dignity became a community's rallying cry. Crystal Johnson had always believed in the power of community. At 28, she dedicated her life to social work, spending her days helping families navigate crisis situations and advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. She understood injustice intimately. She'd seen it in the faces of the children she worked with, heard it in the stories of the families she served. But nothing had prepared her for what would happen on this particular Saturday afternoon in downtown Millbrook. Crystal had driven into the city center for a community meeting about youth programs, arriving early to grab lunch and do some shopping. The downtown area buzzed with weekend energy, families strolling with children, couples window shopping, teenagers hanging out near the fountain. It was the kind of diverse, vibrant scene that made Crystal hopeful about her community's future. She'd just finished browsing at Nelson's Boutique, a small clothing store owned by Janet Nelson, a middle-aged white woman who'd run the shop for over 15 years. Janet had always prided herself on treating all customers equally, but like many business owners in the area, she'd learned to keep her head down when it came to controversial situations. "Don't get involved" had become her unofficial motto, a philosophy that was about to be severely tested. 3 blocks away, Officer Tom Smith was having the kind of day that fed his worst impulses. A 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, Tom had accumulated more civilian complaints than any other officer on the force, yet somehow managed to keep his job through a combination of union protection and administrative indifference. At 52, he was bitter, angry, and convinced that the world was changing in ways that threatened everything he believed in. Tom had grown up in Millbrook when it was predominantly white, and he'd watched with growing resentment as the community became more diverse. To him, every black face in the downtown area represented a threat to his neighborhood. He'd developed a reputation for aggressive stops, excessive force, and what his colleagues euphemistically called old-school policing. Today, Tom was patrolling alone. His usual partner had called in sick, leaving him without the moderating influence that sometimes kept his worst tendencies in check. He'd already made 2 questionable stops that morning, both involving young black men who'd committed no crime other than existing in spaces Tom felt they didn't belong. As Crystal emerged from Nelson's Boutique, carrying a small shopping bag and checking her phone for the time, she had no idea she was about to become Tom's next target. She was simply a young black woman in a nice neighborhood, and in Tom's twisted worldview, that was suspicious enough. Also present in the downtown area were 3 other individuals whose lives were about to intersect with Crystal's in ways none of them could have imagined. Jerry D. Wagner, a 73-year-old Korean War veteran, sat on his usual bench outside the coffee shop, watching the world go by. Jerry had seen enough injustice in his lifetime to recognize it when he saw it, but at his age, he'd grown comfortable with the role of observer rather than participant. Today, that was going to change. George Stark, a 35-year-old father of two, was waiting for his wife to finish shopping in the pharmacy. A software engineer by trade, George had always considered himself socially conscious, but had never been forced to put his principles into action. He carried his phone everywhere, documenting his family's life through countless photos and videos, never imagining he'd soon be documenting something that would change his community forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone's moral courage and reveal the true character of a community when faced with injustice. Crystal was walking toward her car, mentally reviewing her notes for the afternoon meeting, when she heard the heavy footsteps behind her. She'd learned long ago to be aware of her surroundings, especially when alone, but something about the deliberate pace of these footsteps made her nervous. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was gruff, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. Crystal turned to see Officer Tom Smith approaching, his hand resting casually on his belt, his eyes already scanning her with the kind of predatory assessment that made her skin crawl. She'd dealt with police officers in her professional capacity many times, and she could usually tell within seconds whether she was dealing with someone who saw her as a human being or as a problem to be solved. Tom Smith definitely fell into the latter category. "Yes, officer?" Crystal kept her voice steady, professional. She knew the rules of engagement. Be respectful. Don't give them any excuse to escalate. Document everything if possible. "I need to ask you a few questions." Tom's eyes fixed on her shopping bag. "There's been reports of shoplifting in this area, and I need to check your receipt." Crystal felt her heart rate increase, but she maintained her composure. "Of course, officer. I have my receipt right here." She reached into her purse, pulling out the small slip of paper Janet Nelson had given her just minutes earlier. Tom barely glanced at the receipt before handing it back. "This could be fake. I'm going to need to search your bag." "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I've shown you my receipt. I haven't done anything wrong." Crystal's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. Years of advocacy work had taught her to stand her ground while remaining respectful. "Are you refusing to cooperate with a police investigation?" Tom's voice rose slightly, and Crystal noticed that people were beginning to stop and stare. This was exactly what she'd hoped to avoid. "I'm not refusing anything, officer. I'm simply asking what specific crime you suspect me of committing. I provided my receipt, and I'm happy to cooperate within my rights." The word rights seemed to trigger something in Tom. His face flushed red, and his posture became more aggressive. "Your rights? Let me tell you about your rights. You're in my neighborhood, acting suspicious, and when I try to investigate, you want to lecture me about rights?" Crystal felt the familiar chill of recognition. This wasn't about shoplifting. This wasn't about any crime at all. This was about a white police officer who saw a black woman in his space and decided she didn't belong. "Officer, I live in this community. I work here. I have every right to be here." Crystal's voice was getting stronger, and she could see more people stopping to watch the interaction. "We'll see about that." Tom stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." "For what? What am I being arrested for?" "Resisting arrest, failure to comply with a lawful order, and suspected theft." Tom was making it up as he went along, and they both knew it. Crystal looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers. Most were keeping their distance, watching with the kind of morbid fascination people have for car accidents. A few were pulling out phones, but no one was intervening. "Officer, please. I haven't resisted anything. I've been completely cooperative. I'm a social worker in this community, and I'm asking you to please reconsider this course of action." But Tom was beyond reason now. The crowd, Crystal's articulate responses, and his own growing embarrassment at the situation he'd created were feeding his anger. He grabbed Crystal's arm roughly, spinning her around toward a nearby car. "I said, turn around." Crystal stumbled but maintained her balance. "Officer, you're hurting me. Please, let go of my arm." "You should have thought about that before you decided to mouth off to me." Tom's grip tightened, and Crystal could feel his fingers digging into her arm hard enough to leave bruises. That's when Jerry D. Wagner stood up from his bench. The elderly veteran had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort. He'd seen enough bullies in his lifetime to recognize one, and he'd seen enough injustice to know it when it was happening right in front of him. At 73, Jerry had thought his fighting days were behind him, but something about watching this young woman being humiliated by a man who was supposed to protect and serve awakened something in him that he thought had died decades ago. "Officer, is there a problem here?" Jerry's voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who'd faced down much worse than an angry cop. Tom looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "This is police business, old man. Move along." "I can see it's police business. I'm asking what the young lady did wrong." Crystal felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who was willing to speak up for her. "Thank you, sir. I haven't done anything wrong. I showed him my receipt, but he—" "Shut up." Tom yanked on Crystal's arm again, harder this time. "Nobody asked you to speak." The rough treatment caused Crystal to stumble again, and this time she fell against the car, her shopping bag spilling its contents onto the sidewalk. Tom, frustrated and embarrassed by the growing attention, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He grabbed the front of Crystal's white blouse and yanked. The fabric tore with a sound that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent crowd. Crystal's blouse ripped open down the front, exposing her bra and leaving her desperately trying to cover herself, while Tom still maintained his grip on her arm. "Oh my God!" The voice came from Janet Nelson, who had emerged from her boutique to see what the commotion was about. The sight of her customer, a woman who had been nothing but polite and respectful in her store, being publicly humiliated in such a degrading way, shocked her to her core. Crystal's eyes filled with tears, not from physical pain, but from the overwhelming humiliation of being exposed and degraded in front of dozens of strangers. "Please," she whispered, "please let me cover myself." But Tom wasn't done. The tearing of her clothing seemed to have unleashed something primal in him, and he was too far gone to stop now. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before disrespecting a police officer," he snarled, maintaining his grip on both her arm and the torn fabric of her shirt. That's when George Stark pulled out his phone and started recording. George Stark's hands were shaking as he held up his phone, but he kept recording. As a father of 2 daughters, the sight of Crystal being humiliated and exposed had triggered something deep and protective in him. He had always told himself he was one of the good ones, someone who believed in equality and justice. But he'd never been tested. Today that test had arrived. "Hey!" George's voice cut through the crowd. "What you're doing is wrong. Let her go." Tom's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with fury. "Put that phone away and mind your own business." "This is my business. This is everyone's business." George kept recording, his voice getting stronger. "You just tore that woman's clothing off in public. That's assault." The word assault seemed to ripple through the crowd like electricity. People who had been passive observers suddenly realized they were witnessing something criminal, something that demanded a response. Janet Nelson, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly found her voice. "Officer, I sold her that blouse not 10 minutes ago. She has a receipt. She didn't steal anything." "I don't care what you think you saw," Tom shot back, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The crowd was growing, and their mood was shifting from curious to hostile. Jerry D. Wagner took a step closer, his military bearing evident despite his age. "Son, I've been watching this whole thing, and that young lady hasn't done anything wrong. You need to let her go and let her cover herself." "I'm not your son, old man, and I don't take orders from civilians." But Tom's grip on Crystal loosened slightly as he realized he was outnumbered and being recorded from multiple angles. Crystal, still trying to hold her torn blouse together, found her voice again. "Please, I just want to cover myself and go home. I haven't done anything wrong." "You haven't done anything wrong," agreed a new voice from the crowd. It was Maria Santos, a local teacher who had been shopping with her teenage daughter. "Officer, what you're doing is completely inappropriate. That woman deserves to be treated with dignity." "Dignity?" Tom laughed bitterly. She lost her right to dignity when she decided to disrespect me. Disrespect you how? George was still recording, and his question was loud enough for everyone to hear. By asking what crime she was suspected of? By showing you her receipt? By exercising her constitutional rights? The crowd was growing larger and more vocal. People were pulling out phones, some recording, others calling friends and family to come witness what was happening. Social media posts were already going live, tagged with Millbrook Police and Justice for Crystal. Tom realized he was losing control of the situation, and his response was to double down on aggression. All of you need to disperse immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business. What police business? Jerry's voice was steady and calm, but there was steel underneath. Humiliating a young woman who committed no crime? Tearing her clothing off in public? If that's police business, then we need new police. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People were nodding, some calling out their own agreement. The dynamic was shifting, and Tom could feel it. Janet Nelson surprised herself by stepping forward. She'd spent 15 years avoiding confrontation, but watching Crystal, her customer, a woman who had been nothing but kind and respectful, being degraded in front of her store was more than she could bear. Officer, I'm the store owner. I can verify that this woman purchased that blouse legally. She has done nothing wrong, and what you're doing to her is shameful. Shameful. Tom's voice cracked slightly. I'm doing my job. Your job is to protect and serve, called out another voice from the crowd. How is humiliating an innocent woman protecting anyone? Crystal, emboldened by the support surrounding her, straightened her shoulders despite her state of undress. She said, reading his name tag, I am a social worker in this community. I help families in crisis. I have never been arrested, never been in trouble with the law. I came downtown today to attend a meeting about youth programs. I bought a blouse from Ms. Nelson's store, and I was walking to my car when you stopped me. I have done nothing wrong, and you have no right to treat me this way. Her words, delivered with quiet dignity despite her humiliation, seemed to galvanize the crowd even further. People were openly expressing their outrage now, and Tom found himself surrounded by dozens of angry faces. She's right, called out George, still recording. This is what racism looks like. This is what abuse of power looks like. Racism? Tom's face turned purple. This has nothing to do with race. This is about law and order. Law and order? Jerry stepped even closer, and despite being in his 70s, there was something intimidating about the old veteran. I fought in Korea for law and order. Real law and order. Not this. This is just bullying. The crowd was pressing closer now, not threateningly, but with the kind of collective determination that comes when people realize they have the power to stop injustice. Tom was beginning to understand that his usual tactics, intimidation, aggression, the assumption that his badge made him untouchable, weren't working. All of you need to back off. Tom's voice was getting higher, more desperate. I'm calling for backup. Good, said Maria Santos. Call for backup. Call for your supervisor. Call for anyone who can explain why you think it's acceptable to tear a woman's clothing off in public. Tom reached for his radio, but his hands were shaking. The situation had spiraled completely out of his control, and for the first time in his 20-year career he was genuinely afraid. Not of physical violence. The crowd wasn't threatening him physically, but of something much worse. Accountability. Crystal, still holding her torn blouse together, looked around at the faces surrounding her. These were strangers who had chosen to stand up for her when they could have just walked away. They had seen injustice and decided to act, and their courage was giving her strength. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. Thank you all for not looking away. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone tense. Tom's backup was arriving, and no one knew whether that would make things better or worse. The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people, with more arriving every minute, as word spread through social media and text messages. George was still recording, but now he wasn't alone. At least a dozen phones were capturing every moment, every word, every expression on Tom's increasingly panicked face. The hashtag Millbrook Police was trending locally, and the videos were being shared faster than anyone could count. "Listen," Tom said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that was completely different from his earlier aggression. "This is all a big misunderstanding. The woman was acting suspicious, and I was just doing my job." "Your job doesn't include tearing women's clothing off," Janet Nelson said firmly. The store owner had found a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I've been in business here for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Jerry D. Wagner positioned himself between Tom and Crystal, his military bearing evident despite his age. "Young lady," he said to Crystal, "would you like to use my jacket to cover yourself?" Crystal nodded gratefully, and Jerry shrugged out of his light windbreaker, handing it to her with a kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed to highlight Tom's brutish behavior even more starkly. "Thank you," Crystal said, wrapping the jacket around herself. The simple act of being treated with dignity and respect by this stranger made her emotional, but it also made her stronger. The sirens were getting closer, and Tom was growing more desperate. "Look, maybe we can work this out. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," said George, still recording, "is you thinking you could get away with this. But we all saw what you did. We all recorded it. And we're not going to let you pretend it didn't happen." A police cruiser pulled up, and Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez stepped out. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran with a reputation for fairness and professionalism, everything Tom Smith was not. She took one look at the crowd, at Crystal wrapped in Jerry's jacket, at Tom's panicked expression, and immediately understood that something serious had happened. "What's the situation here?" Rodriguez asked, her voice calm but authoritative. The crowd erupted in voices, everyone trying to explain at once. Rodriguez held up her hand for silence, one at a time. "Ma'am," she said, addressing Crystal, "are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm not physically injured," Crystal said. "But Officer Smith tore my clothing and humiliated me in front of all these people. I haven't done anything wrong." Rodriguez looked at Tom, who was sweating profusely despite the cool afternoon air. "Officer Smith, what's your version of events?" Tom launched into a rambling explanation about suspicious behavior and resisting arrest, but his story was immediately contradicted by multiple witnesses. "That's not what happened," called out Janet Nelson. "I sold her that blouse 10 minutes before he stopped her. She had a receipt. I recorded the whole thing." George held up his phone. "He grabbed her and tore her shirt for no reason." "The young lady was completely respectful," added Jerry. "She answered his questions, showed her receipt, and asked what she was being accused of. That's when he got violent." Rodriguez looked around at the crowd, at the phone still recording, at the obvious distress on Crystal's face. She'd been a cop long enough to recognize the truth when she heard it, and she'd worked with Tom Smith long enough to know exactly what kind of officer he was. "Officer Smith," she said quietly, "I need you to step away from the civilian and come talk to me." "Sergeant, this woman was..." "Now, Officer Smith." Tom reluctantly moved away from Crystal, and Rodriguez positioned herself between them. The crowd watched intently, understanding that this moment would determine whether justice would be served or covered up. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to Crystal, "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez. I want you to know that what you've described is completely unacceptable behavior for a police officer. I'm going to need to get your statement, and I want you to know that this incident will be thoroughly investigated." Crystal felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone in authority was treating her like a human being. "Sergeant," George called out, still recording, "we have multiple videos of what happened. Officer Smith tore this woman's clothing off in public after she showed him her receipt and asked what she was being accused of." Rodriguez nodded. "I'll need copies of those videos for the investigation. This is exactly the kind of documentation that helps ensure accountability." Tom's face went white. The videos meant there would be no way to spin this, no way to make it disappear. His career was over, and he knew it. "Sergeant, I can explain." "You'll have plenty of opportunity to explain, Officer Smith. Right now I need you to return to your vehicle and wait for me there." The crowd watched as Tom, his earlier arrogance completely deflated, walked slowly back to his patrol car. The man who had seemed so powerful and intimidating just minutes earlier now looked small and pathetic. Crystal straightened her shoulders, still wrapped in Jerry's jacket but standing tall. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want to file a formal complaint. What Officer Smith did to me was assault, and it was motivated by racism. I won't let this be swept under the rug. You have every right to file a complaint, ma'am, and I encourage you to do so. You also have the right to press criminal charges if you choose to." The crowd erupted in applause. Justice wasn't just possible, it was happening. Jerry D. Wagner stepped forward. "Sergeant, I'm a witness to everything that happened here. That young lady conducted herself with dignity and respect throughout this entire ordeal. Officer Smith's behavior was disgraceful. I appreciate your willingness to serve as a witness, sir. I'll need statements from everyone who saw what happened." Janet Nelson raised her hand. "I'm the store owner. I can verify that she purchased that blouse legally and had a receipt. There was no theft, no suspicious behavior, nothing that justified what he did to her." Maria Santos stepped forward with her teenage daughter. "My daughter and I both witnessed this. We want her to see that when people stand up against injustice, things can change." George was still recording, but now his camera was focused on Crystal. "Ma'am, you showed incredible strength and dignity today. Is there anything you want to say to people who might be watching this?" Crystal looked around at the crowd of strangers who had become her allies, at the phones recording her words, at the opportunity to turn her humiliation into something meaningful. "I want to say thank you," she began, her voice strong and clear. "Thank you to everyone who didn't just walk by. Thank you to everyone who spoke up when they saw something wrong. What happened to me today was wrong, but what happened next? All of you refusing to let it stand. That gives me hope." She paused, looking directly into George's camera. "To anyone watching this, injustice happens when good people do nothing. But when good people stand up, when they refuse to look away, when they use their voices and their phones and their presence to demand better, that's when change happens. That's when we become the community we want to live in." The crowd erupted in applause again, and even Sergeant Rodriguez was nodding approvingly. Tom Smith, sitting in his patrol car, could hear the applause. He could see the crowd celebrating, could see Crystal being treated like a hero while he sat alone and disgraced. For the first time in his career, he was truly speechless. Within an hour, the videos of Crystal's humiliation and the crowd's response had been viewed thousands of times. The hashtag Justice for Crystal was trending not just locally but statewide, and news outlets were already reaching out for interviews. Sergeant Rodriguez had taken detailed statements from Crystal and multiple witnesses. The evidence was overwhelming. Officer Tom Smith had assaulted an innocent woman motivated by racial bias in full view of dozens of witnesses and multiple cameras. "Ms. Johnson," Rodriguez said as she finished taking Crystal's statement, "I want you to know that Officer Smith has been suspended pending a full investigation. Based on what I've seen and heard today, I expect that suspension to become termination very quickly." Crystal nodded, still wearing Jerry's jacket over her torn blouse. "What about criminal charges?" "That will be up to the district attorney, but I'll be recommending charges for assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of power under color of authority. The video evidence makes this a very strong case." Jerry D. Wagner, who had stayed throughout the entire process, approached Crystal. "Young lady, I want you to know how impressed I am with your courage today. You stood up for yourself with dignity and grace, even when that man was trying to break you down." "I couldn't have done it without all of you," Crystal replied. "When I saw people standing up for me, it gave me strength I didn't know I had." George Stark had finally stopped recording, but he was still energized by what had happened. "This is going to change things," he said. "People are going to see this video and realize they can't just stand by when they see injustice." Janet Nelson approached Crystal with a shopping bag. "I brought you a new blouse," she said quietly. "The same style but in blue. It's on the house." Crystal's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have said something the moment I saw him grab you. I'm sorry it took me so long to find my voice. You found it when it mattered, Crystal assured her. That's what counts. Maria Santos and her teenage daughter approached next. My daughter wants to say something, Maria said. The teenager, who couldn't have been more than 16, looked nervous but determined. I just wanted to say that watching you today taught me something important. You showed me what it looks like to stand up for yourself with dignity, and everyone else showed me what it looks like to stand up for what's right. I won't forget this. Crystal smiled at the young woman. And I won't forget that your generation is watching and learning. That gives me hope for the future. As the crowd began to disperse, people continued to approach Crystal, some to offer support, others to share their own stories of discrimination, still others to ask how they could help ensure that Officer Smith faced consequences for his actions. Dr. Michael Chen, a local physician who had arrived after hearing about the incident on social media, offered to examine Crystal for injuries. Even if you don't feel hurt now, the adrenaline might be masking pain or injury, he explained. Crystal accepted the offer, and Dr. Chen's examination revealed bruising on her arm where Tom had grabbed her, as well as minor abrasions from being pushed against the car. He documented everything carefully, knowing it would be important evidence. The physical injuries will heal quickly, Dr. Chen told her, but I want you to know that what you experienced today was traumatic. If you need counseling or support services, I can provide referrals. Crystal thanked him, but explained that she was a social worker herself and had access to professional support. What I need most right now is to see this through to the end. I need to make sure Officer Smith faces real consequences, and I need to make sure this becomes a catalyst for change in our community. As the afternoon wore on, local news crews arrived to cover the story. Crystal agreed to interviews, using each opportunity to emphasize the importance of bystander intervention and community solidarity. What happened to me today was wrong, she told Channel 7 News, but what happened next was beautiful. People who didn't know me, who had no obligation to get involved, chose to stand up for what was right. They chose to use their voices, their phones, their presence to demand justice. That's how change happens. The reporter asked about Officer Smith's future. I hope he faces the full consequences of his actions, Crystal replied. But more than that, I hope this incident leads to real reforms in how police officers are trained, supervised, and held accountable. One bad officer losing his job isn't enough if the system that enabled him remains unchanged. By evening, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. The video of Tom Smith tearing Crystal's blouse, followed by the crowd's response and Crystal's dignified statements, had struck a nerve across the country. Police Chief Robert Martinez held a press conference that evening, announcing that Officer Smith had been suspended without pay, pending a full investigation. The behavior captured in today's videos is completely contrary to our department's values and training, he said. We will cooperate fully with any criminal investigation, and we will take whatever disciplinary action is warranted by the facts. But the community wasn't satisfied with just words. A group of local activists, inspired by the day's events, announced plans for a town hall meeting to discuss police reform and accountability measures. Crystal, exhausted but determined, agreed to participate. Today showed me that our community has the power to demand better, she said. Now we need to use that power to create lasting change. As she finally drove home that evening, still wearing Jerry's jacket over her new blue blouse, Crystal reflected on how a day that had started with such humiliation had ended with such hope. She thought about Jerry's courage, George's quick thinking with his phone, Janet's eventual willingness to speak up, and the dozens of other people who had chosen to act rather than just watch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Interviews with investigators, meetings with lawyers, the hard work of turning outrage into reform. But tonight, Crystal felt something she hadn't expected to feel after being assaulted by a police officer. She felt hopeful. The community had shown her that she wasn't alone, that injustice didn't have to be accepted, and that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to stand together. Officer Tom Smith, meanwhile, sat in his empty house, watching the news coverage of his disgrace. For 20 years, he'd believed his badge made him untouchable. Today, he'd learned that when a community decides it's had enough, even a badge can't protect you from the consequences of your action. He was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, completely speechless. 3 months later, the transformation was remarkable. Officer Tom Smith had been fired from the police department and was facing criminal charges for assault and civil rights violations. The district attorney, responding to public pressure and overwhelming evidence, had pursued the case aggressively. But the real change went far deeper than one officer's downfall. The Millbrook Police Department had implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, and a civilian oversight board was established to review complaints and use-of-force incidents. Crystal Johnson had become an unlikely activist, speaking at conferences and community meetings about the power of bystander intervention. She'd partnered with Jerry D. Wagner to create a program called Courage in Community, which trained people to safely intervene when they witnessed injustice. What I learned that day, Crystal would tell audiences, is that heroes aren't born, they're made. In moments when ordinary people decide they've seen enough. Jerry could have stayed on his bench. George could have kept his phone in his pocket. Janet could have stayed in her store. But they didn't. They chose to act, and that choice changed everything. Jerry, despite his age, had become one of the program's most effective trainers. "I spent too many years thinking my fighting days were behind me," he would say. "But some fights are too important to leave to the next generation." George Stark had used his technical skills to create an app called Witness, which allowed people to quickly and safely document incidents of injustice while automatically backing up videos to secure cloud storage. The app had been downloaded over 100,000 times and had already been used to document dozens of incidents across the country. Janet Nelson had transformed her boutique into more than just a clothing store. She'd created a community space where people could gather to discuss social issues and plan activism. "I spent 15 years keeping my head down," she would tell visitors. "I thought that was the safe thing to do. But I learned that silence isn't safety, it's complicity." The ripple effects extended far beyond Millbrook. The video of Crystal's assault and the community's response had been viewed millions of times, inspiring similar acts of courage in communities across the country. The hashtag Justice for Crystal had evolved into a broader movement encouraging bystander intervention and community accountability. Dr. Michael Chen had worked with local hospitals to create protocols for documenting injuries from police encounters, ensuring that victims had the medical evidence they needed to pursue justice. Maria Santos and her daughter had started a youth program teaching teenagers about their rights during police encounters and the importance of documenting injustice when they witnessed it. The town hall meetings that began in the aftermath of Crystal's assault had become a regular feature of Millbrook's civic life, with citizens actively participating in discussions about police reform, racial justice, and community building. But perhaps the most important change was in the community's understanding of its own power. People had learned that they didn't have to wait for someone else to act, that they didn't have to accept injustice as inevitable, and that their voices and actions could create real change. Crystal often returned to the spot where her assault had occurred, not out of trauma, but out of gratitude. It was there that she learned what her community was capable of when it chose courage over comfort, action over apathy. "People ask me if I'm angry about what happened," she would say. "And yes, I'm angry about the assault, about the humiliation, about the racism that motivated it. But I'm not angry about the experience as a whole, because it showed me something beautiful about human nature. It showed me that when people are given the choice between looking away and standing up, many of them will choose to stand up." The bench where Jerry D. Wagner had been sitting that day now bore a small plaque, "In honor of all who choose courage over comfort." It had become a gathering place for the community, a reminder of what was possible when people refused to be bystanders to injustice. Tom Smith, meanwhile, had been convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His conviction had sent a message that police officers were not above the law and that communities had the power to hold them accountable. But for Crystal and the others who had been part of that transformative day, the real victory wasn't in one man's punishment. It was in the community's awakening to its own power and responsibility. What would you do if you witnessed something like this? How do you think your community would respond? The power to create change doesn't belong to politicians or police chiefs or activists. It belongs to all of us, in every moment when we choose to act rather than look away. Crystal Johnson's story reminds us that injustice thrives in silence, but it cannot survive in the light of collective action. Every day, in communities across the world, people face the choice between being bystanders and being upstanders. The difference between those two choices is often the difference between perpetuating injustice and creating change. The heroes of this story weren't superheroes. They were an elderly veteran, a software engineer, a store owner, a teacher, a doctor, and dozens of other ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice. They chose to see Crystal's humanity, to recognize injustice when it was happening in front of them, and to use whatever power they had, their voices, their phones, their presence, to demand better. Their courage didn't just save Crystal from further humiliation. It transformed an entire community and inspired countless others to find their own courage when faced with injustice. The question isn't whether you'll ever witness injustice. You will. The question is what you'll do when that moment comes. Will you look away, or will you stand up? Will you stay silent, or will you speak? Will you walk by, or will you be the person who changes everything? Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Your courage can change someone's life, and it can change your community. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it made you think about your own role in creating a more just world, then share it, like this video, subscribe to our channel, and most importantly, tell us in the comments, what will you do the next time you witness injustice? How will you be the change your community needs? And remember, heroes aren't born, they're made in moments when ordinary people decide they've seen enough and choose to act. The next hero could be you. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of the solution. Until next time, keep standing up for what's right.